if you go across the country and ask folks, do you feel safe? Do you feel, often what you will hear in many different places is that people don't feel safe. And many of those places are some of the places with the largest police forces and the largest police budgets.
I'm joined today by Philip V. McHarris. Phil, thank you for being on Urgent Futures.
Thank you for having me.
First of all, you're in LA on a book tour for Beyond Policing, which we're going to talk about. But I'm curious, given everything that is in the book, what your experience of LA has been like.
I actually talk about LA a decent amount in the book, both in terms of historical points, in terms of thinking about policing, and also thinking about some of the different examples and models and approaches in LA and some of the work that's happening as well. And so it's been good. It's definitely a very interesting, place, and I like it. I'm from New York City, so I was always like, what's going on in LA? And so it's good to be in the space and to, just be in conversation with folks. So it's also there's a lot around policing that, is in LA. And so thinking about all of those things within the context of being here has also been, definitely interesting.
Cool.
Like in LA.
Cool. So Beyond Policing jumps off from the question of what would society look like if there were no police? Talk to me about the background, like what research led you there, what life experiences led you to pursue this book?
For sure. So I think from early on, just growing up, I'm originally from the Bronx, New York, and one of my first memories is around policing, and I talk about it in the introduction, and I think from there on, it was just so many different experiences that I had around policing, police violence, police harassment related to me, people that I've been close to, my family members, my loved ones. And so, I think that created the foundation for having a sense of that policing was, not a legitimate institution as it was often, framed to be. And, at the same time, I had a number of concerns around safety, and so there was this juxtaposition where, we're told that police are the answer to problems around safety. But at the same time, I can see that they're not. I have a number of things happening within my own life that I've experienced, and people, around me that I see them experiencing, that police are not answering. And in many ways, police are adding to the web of harm and violence and conflict that people are experiencing on a day-to-day. And so, I really think that created a foundation, a pretext for me to see policing as not a viable option for safety. I always knew that. And I also knew that there were a number of safety concerns that myself and a number of folks in my community shared. So in 2014, after the murder of Michael Brown, there was a movement, an uprising, and a movement that emerged that really started to shift the conversation, I think in public discourse, and also just in terms of my involvement within that movement. I spent time protesting in Ferguson, as well as, in New York City and Baltimore around this time. And I also was an organizer with an organization called BYP 100. And I literally remember walking down the street with a couple of the folks that I was organizing with at the time, and a conversation just sparked around alternatives to policing. And I just remember gravitating towards it so much because historically, I had this foundation of this premise that, okay, I don't see policing as a viable option for safety, and I see the active ways in which it creates unsafe conditions, for me and for many others, but there wasn't necessarily an off-ramp. And so when I started to have these conversations, that built on decades of work, from abolitionists, folks involved in collectives like Critical Resistance, and a movement that had been growing for a while. The conversation really started to shift because people started to have different kinds of conversations. And I just remember hearing, folks talking about alternatives to safety and community-based approaches. And I just gravitated towards it so much because it created a answer to two problems. One is that there's a lot of, conditions that create a sense of unsafety for many people in many different communities. And at the same time, policing also does that. It also creates, unsafe conditions for many, and that's something that I've always felt. And so this idea that communities can practice approaches to safety that can actually keep us safe and also creates a context in which there is no encounter with policing, it really struck me. And so I spent, from then on the next 10 years really like digging into, ways to think about safety and accountability and justice beyond policing and prisons. And a part of what, this book is a culmination of those studies, those thoughts, those conversations, and being involved in spaces where people were really challenging, what we currently understand as just, what it always has been and what it always has to be.
Mm. Yeah, the book, I obviously there are going to be folks who are already abolitionists, who already understand many of the ways that policing actually isn't leading to public safety outcomes. But obviously there's a lot of people also who are going to be skeptical of that idea, who that idea makes them feel fear. Your book really deftly addresses a lot of those skepticisms, and I want to spend a lot of time on that. But before we do, I think it's probably worthwhile to pick up with kind of where you begin in the book, which is this history of policing, to help make it make sense that policing is actually not this age-old institution that's this naturally occurring phenomenon among people. It's a relatively recent convention that was created for very specific ends. So I'd love to invite you, if you could, to kind of share a brief view of that history.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, I start with the histories section for that purpose, right? Is because a part of when I got to grad school in 2014, and so I had been thinking about all this. I've been, involved in different conversations. There were, these movements happening that were challenging conversation, and I was in grad school. And when I got to grad school, I really started to ask folks and ask, professors, and I said, I want to understand the histories of policing. And what I found was that, it was hard to just get get pointed in the direction of this is a critical history around policing that showed you, where they came from, their development. And, often what would happen, it was sort of this patchwork of you can look here or you can look here. And there was different pieces of the puzzle, but I wanted to see the big picture. And it was very challenging for me, for those first couple of years to figure out and to chart those histories. And so a part of what I started to do early on is started to trace those histories. I started to sort of knit together, the different, the different texts, the different readings. I started to dig into the archives to say, policing hasn't always existed. So where did it come from and how has it become so powerful? And early on, what I started to realize was that squarely rooted at the foundation of policing is as a tool of race and class control. And we can see that manifest in different ways. And another thing that I realized early on about the histories of policing is that there's no one linear history of policing in the U.S., which is why it was so complicated early on to get the history that I was looking for, was because it evolves differently in different geographies in different ways. But at the core of it, again, is this desire for race class control that we see. And there's also this aspect of creating some semblance of security for those deemed worthy of protection, right? And so when we look historically, we can see different models developing at different points in time. So in the early 1700s, we start to see slave patrols develop as a model, which scholars have identified as one of the earliest forms of policing models in the U.S. And the focus of slave patrols was in order to repress and quell any sort of idea around rebellion, and also to prevent enslaved people from fleeing and from running away and from liberating themselves, and an attempt to return them back to their enslavers when they sought to free themselves. And so we can look at this model of slave patrols. We can also look in the West, we can look at the development of Texas Rangers and their role in westward expansion and the dispossession and violence against Mexican and indigenous populations. And then we can also look to more sort of what we understand as more modernized police departments that started to emerge in the 1800s in cities like Boston and Philadelphia, in New York City, where a lot of what the focus was around, creating a police force that can engage in labor control, right? So to repress and to quell labor organizing, and to when if there were strikes, if there were protests, police served a major function of quelling and repressing those efforts, and also engaging in various forms of immigration enforcement, and really just enforcing the status quo at the time. And so, we see that at different points, the specific developments have shifted and changed, but what we see as a constant, as a through line, is this focus around race class control. And we also see a focus around the international and transnational development of policing as an institution. And so, one of the things that I was looking for, as I mentioned, is sort of in thinking about the history of policing is, when we think about where police come from, part of what became very apparent to me was that there was so much importing and exporting of ideas, strategies, technologies around policing at the origins of the development of the institution to begin with. And so we can look to, the use of imperial militaries across the globe by, colonial empires in order to control, subjugated people within those spaces. And so, we can look to Britain and the use of a military force in order to engage in control over Irish colonized populations. We can also look to imperial military occupations in places like the Philippines, Guam, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and see that there was literally direct linkages between those imperial military occupations and what would become policing in the context of the U.S. And we can look to folks like August Vollmer and others who were engaged in actively trying to create, a policing entity that mirrored some of these, imperial occupations and imperial strategies and tactics and techniques. And so even when we think about the militarization of police, we can look back, to the origin. Scholars like Julian Go have theorized this as imperial feedback, that a part of what cohered and made sense out of policing in the U.S. was this back and forth between ideas and strategies and tactics that was occurring throughout, the globe, from out of a desire to engage in imperial control. So as I mentioned, in grad school, I really wanted to understand and think through histories of policing. And so this first section is really the reading that I wanted to read to really understand, what the history of policing was in the context of the U.S.
Mm. And you identify the mid 20th century, particularly 1965, as this moment where U.S. policing evolves into something that begins to look like what we recognize it as today. What was happening in the mid-century, and what happened progressively through the 20th century that then further solidified the police into becoming, what we understand it today?
Right. Okay, so the mid-1960s is a major point in what would become the development of policing as we know it today. And so you have a number of different protest movements, right? You have anti-war protests, you have civil rights protests, you have the burgeoning Black Power movement, you have so many different kinds of protest movements in the context of the U.S. that this created a destabilizing force for those interested in maintaining the status quo. We also see a number of rebellions that spread across the nation. And the Kerner Commission report talks about these rebellions, and one of the major indicators in over half of the urban rebellions in the 1960s was directly precipitated by an incident of police violence. And so a part of what this created was a lot of unrest and a lot of, concern around how to restabilize the status quo and, repress these movements. And so in 1965, with, at the time, President Lyndon B. Johnson, you see the launch of the Law Enforcement Assistance Act in 1965, which creates the first federal funding mechanism for local, state, law enforcement. And so you see over the decades a rapid ballooning and growth of police expenditure, police tools, police techniques, police strategies that really proliferated after this period of time when, now there was an availability of funds. And so beforehand, there wasn't the level of sort of organization or development at mass scale across the United States. But a part of what 1965 and the Law Enforcement Assistance Act, what it kickstarts is the federal investment in policing. And, a part of what you see in the 1960s is that following this investment in federal resources around policing, you see the rapid expansion, both in terms of resources, police personnel, police equipment, police, gear, and that really takes us, into the coming decades. And so, following the coming decades, you have things like the war on drugs. You have Nixon, you have Reaganomics, and that also again fuels this expansion further and further. So in the 1990s, you have the crime bill, right? Bill Clinton. And the 1994 crime bill, which really expanded policing as well as incarceration in the United States. And it was one of the largest federal investments since 1965 with the Law Enforcement Assistance Act. And really what you see following that is again, this rapid expansion and proliferation of policing, police gear, police equipment, and police personnel across the United States. And so, there's these different moments, but 1965, the mid-1960s was really a period that sparked the policing that we know, now, where over $100 billion is spent on policing. That wasn't nearly the case, when we look prior to the 1960s. And so, it was a pivotal time, and it really served as the most immediate pretext for what would become policing as we know it today. Even things like 911, wasn't even developed until, as a number, wasn't developed until the late 1960s. And so you just see a number of different SWAT teams emerge, and a number of different kinds of policing strategies and tactics and formations that emerge out of all of this investment that would become, the police boom.
Yeah. Just the idea that 911 is such a relatively new convention, and the effect it had in streamlining first response calls to the police, where it creates a culture that any type of emergency you might have just de facto has to go to the police. That was something that I certainly had no idea about. In the 2000s, it's then the Patriot Act and surveillance technologies. How have those woven into police forces?
For sure. And so when we look at the history of 911, it really shows you the power of ideas and narratives, because even when I was looking into that, it surprised me as well, because there's a way in which it seems like 911 has just always been around, similar to the ways it can seem like policing has just always been around, because we're socialized into thinking around these ideas that there's a level of permanence that seem like they've always existed, they always will exist, and they will always look, the ways that they've looked. And so that to me was really, showcasing. And a part of that was to say, if this number, wasn't developed until the 1960s, and it wasn't until 1987 that over 50% of the population even had access to the number, what that means is that we can also have different kinds of numbers. We can have different kinds of approaches, and, the ways that we can think beyond it, are abundant. And so I think that some of these historical points really illuminate for us the ways that these systems seem like they have a level of permanence and historical continuity throughout all of time almost. But that's a product of socialization and thinking about Stuart Hall, who co-publishes a text called Policing the Crisis, and who draws also on Gramsci. These ideas become common sense, or thinking in the language of Gramsci, hegemonic. And so I think, that a part of what I wanted to do in the book is to push back against what seems common sense around policing and the criminal legal system. And so when we go into the 2000s, we see, the Patriot Act, we see surveillance technologies. And just to be clear, surveillance has always been a core function of policing. But as technology changes and grows and expands, so does the capacity for police to mobilize and use those technologies to engage in widespread surveillance. And so a part of what we see at that period of time is, the semblance of certain forms of civil liberties that seem to protect against for certain kinds of surveillance, even though we know that those were not even, strong protections, because we can look at COINTELPRO and we can look at the repression and dismantling of organizations like the Black Panther Party and, AIM, the American Indian Movement, and a number of other movements at the time. And we can see that, surveillance and all of these forms of control and repression were used, as a form of domestic warfare in the context of the United States, in the 1960s. And we can look previously, and we can look, past that to see how race and class control created a context for the police to engage in mass surveillance of particular communities even before this moment. But a part of when we get into the 2000s, what happens is that, the semblance of any kind of, sense of civil liberties around, surveillance and these forms of tools really starts to even get scaled back even more. And so you have the proliferation of devices like Stingray technology and a number of other kinds of tools and techniques and strategies of surveillance that really start to proliferate alongside, as technology starts to develop and proliferate as well. And so that's another thing that you see, is that during moments of technological booms, police will, almost always mobilize the technological innovations for the purpose of control and surveillance. And in some ways, we can also see pushes to expand technology as a response to the desire for control and surveillance and punishment. Even when we think about biometric forms of policing and control, when we think about fingerprints and, the development of the mugshot, all of these things are also forms of technologies that are being developed in order to expand the reach of policing and surveillance. The 2000s were really a moment that catapulted the kinds of surveillance technologies that we see today, into the widespread public.
Mm. There's a fallacy you're identifying at the heart of policing, which is that police create public safety, or police protect public safety. So there's a two-part question there of like, why is that a fallacy? Why is it a fallacy that the police create or protect public safety? And two, what do you propose as a counter that, in your opinion, would create better forms of public safety?
That's a good question. And so, there's different ways where we can look at this idea that policing equals safety. One is we can look historically, and that's what, I look at in the context of the historical section. And what we see is that policing wasn't designed for public safety. It just wasn't, right? And, it was designed as a form of control, specifically in order to engage in racial class control. And it was designed as a colonial construct in order to protect and preserve those with power. And so we can look historically, and through time, we can see that this idea that policing equals safety is not something that aligns with evidence research. And so we can also look to data that shows that, just policing in and of itself, it's not just the case that, you expand police resources or police funding and then, matrices of crime will just go down. And, we see that very apparently. We can also see the kinds of harm and violence that police continuously inflict on particular communities. It really showcases that this is not equating to safety. But a part of what we can look at is also, if we take the premise that, policing is supposed to be a mechanism of public safety, just look across the nation, look at the places with some of the largest police forces. And what you see is that it's not the case that people are just experiencing this widespread safety that they, talk about, that they feel like they can go outside and everything is good, right? And so a part of what that communicates to us is that if you go across the country and ask folks, like, do you feel safe? Do you feel, often what you will hear in many different places is that people don't feel safe. And many of those places are some of the places with the largest police forces and the largest police budgets. So that gets us to a central question. If policing and punishment equated to safety, insofar as we have a nation that is one of the most policed and incarcerated nations across the globe, if there was some kind of immediate relationship, then shouldn't we also experience the most safety? And if that's not the case, that points us to something. That means that policing, punishment, control, surveillance, incarceration, it does not equate to safety. And, even when we look at things like clearance rates, and even when we look at what police do, and I talk about it in the book, is, there was some work that has been done that looks into, what do police spend their time on? And, in the context of cities, there was an article in the New York Times where they looked at a range of different cities, and they found that less than 4% of calls were for anything violent. Less than 1% of calls in a number of cities was for anything that, was defined as serious violence. And so that gets us to a question of what are police doing with their time? Then when we look at clearance rates, we see that they're abysmal all across the country. And so even on the face of what police purport to do and what society says police purport to do, we see that it doesn't do what it's even purporting to do on its face. Those are a few different ways to look at it. And what we see is that police resources, police funding, police personnel, it doesn't just equate to safety. Even, when we take it on its head for what it's said to be. But a part of also the other side is that it's also creating active harm and violence for so many communities. And so a part of what we see when we look at that is that, whether you look at it historically, whether you look at the contemporary patterns, whether you look at what policing is purported to do, and when we even look at what it does just in contemporary society, what we see is that it's not creating this kind of safety that the ideas and narratives suggest, right? A part of what that led me to is to say, then, how can we think about safety? How can we imagine ways to understand safety beyond crime statistics, right? How can we think about how to be in relationship to one another that moves beyond this idea that we have to police and imprison and incarcerate and discipline and surveil, as a measure of quote unquote safety and accountability and justice? When you don't start with the premise that policing and prisons equal safety and justice, the world opens up. We start to see that there are community-based approaches that are actually engaging in safety work that doesn't rely on the violence of policing, And so I include so many different examples in the book to showcase that, like, when we really look, there are an abundance of different kinds of models and approaches that we can see across the nation, but really across the globe, that allow us to see how we can be in relationship to one another differently. And so, one of the things that has come up a lot is crisis response models, right? And so CAHOOTS is one model. MH First, in California is another model that I look to. There's also a number of violence interruption programs. So we can look at hospital-based violence interruption programs. We can look at violence interrupters, and a number of different kinds of initiatives and approaches. And we can also look to different kinds of transformative justice collectives and healing justice collectives that allow us to see a different way of responding to violence and harm once it happens, with the aim of disrupting the cycles of violence and harm from continuing, and really trying to figure out what has created this moment happening to begin with. So there are also a number of different models that are informed by perspectives such as healing justice, transformative justice, restorative justice, that really show us different ways of engaging and responding to moments of violence, harm, and conflict. And a part of what that communicates to us is that a part of what we need to really look at is, why are these patterns occurring to begin with, and trying to disrupt those cycles and patterns, rather than saying policing and prisons and surveillance and punishment is just going to somehow solve and disrupt the patterns, because we see that they're not, right? And so a part of what these frameworks give us is insight into how we can develop other kinds of approaches that allow for safety interventions, that allow for people to get the help and safety that they need when they need it, and also that allow for people to get the kinds of healing and accountability that allows us to disrupt patterns of conflict and violence and harm. And so, there's so many different examples, and a part of what I really try to be intentional about is showcasing, to show, like, a lot of these models and examples, they already exist in many different ways. And so, I think that there are so many different kinds of approaches that we can really engage and invest in order to think beyond, like, the current paradigm. The other piece of this is also all of the social and political and economic realities that give rise to certain kinds of patterns of violence and conflict and harm within communities, and across the nation as well. And a part of it is like we can develop different kinds of alternative responses to a range of things. And one of the things that I like, to offer when I'm engaging and talking with folks is to say, like, we can start from if we don't start from the premise that policing and prisons are the only option for how we understand safety and accountability and justice, we can literally go down a list and communicate and talk and converse with different folks to say, what are the things that you're concerned about? What are the things that would make you feel safe? And actually from square one, really start to develop other kinds of ways of thinking about all of this and engage in the creative, potential in order to develop different kinds of responses and approaches that really give us an off-ramp. But another piece of this is also thinking about things like resources within communities, right? So we know that one of the biggest predictors of conflict and violence and harm within communities is deprivation, poverty, precarity. And so if we know this, then why isn't that being addressed, right? And so we know that if people don't have the resources that they need, a number of consequences come from that. And so if that's known, then we also have to address the underlying causes of all of the societal conditions that give rise to many of the patterns that people don't want to experience within society. But a part of what our current paradigm does is it says, okay, there's inequality. Policing and prisons are going to come in to manage that inequality. When we think about all of the other social and political and economic realities, that creates a context where police is relied upon, and we really seek to transform those conditions, we really can come out the other side with so many different ways of thinking about safety and justice. And that's really what the last part really gets into.
You have this amazing example in that chapter. It's a sort of anecdote about a robbery in a community. I'd love if you could share, and just to sort of set the scene, you're imagining a future in 2105 where we've moved beyond policing and a robbery occurs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good one. Thank you for your deep reading, because that's
an incredible book.
That's in there. When we think about what happens in the case of a robbery now, there might be a police response. They might take a report, then they leave, and usually nothing comes of it, right? And so whatever happened, whatever was taken from you, whatever harm you experienced, it doesn't get addressed. You just have to keep it moving with that experience and without having any kind of intervention that might be useful or helpful for you. And so a part of what I offer in that is to say, what does it look like if folks who are trained in being able to respond to a moment like that can be destabilizing, that can be traumatizing, and that can, really trigger feelings of feeling unsafe. What happens if there was a response that first could deal with the emotional and mental and psychological realities of that moment? And also a response or a team that can engage in immediate work to say, like, well, what was taken of you, right? And so if your bicycle was taken and that's how you get to work every day, how can we create a context in which you have transportation, right? And so, or if money was taken, or if something was taken from you that you need, what does it look like to have resources that can, help people repair in the moment and restore from what was taken? But then there's this other piece around, like, what happens, say, if someone knows about who engaged in the robbery. A part of what I offer is to say is, like, we can have other models that are rooted in transformative justice that, again, seek to say, what caused this to begin with? And so I get into that example in the book to say, like, what caused this? And what are also the conditions that can create a context in where the person who did the robbery doesn't rob anyone else, but also can be accountable to what they did that might have created harm for someone else. When we look right now at the model that currently exists, it doesn't give people the kinds of responses or interventions that they need in order to, one, in the moment, feel some kind of safety or some kind of, help in the moment that really feels helpful. But the other thing is even the responses, the approaches to say, like, oh, well, somebody gets caught, then they go to jail. It doesn't actually get at what caused the underlying issue to begin with. And so if what caused it is something related to somebody not having resources themselves, what does it look like to get them the resources that they also need in order to disrupt them from engaging in cycles that, might be harmful to other people? What it means is getting at the root. And sometimes that can be complicated. But the model that we have right now it actively harms people, and it doesn't work in the ways that it's purported to. And so a part of what, thinking about abolition means is to say we deserve to have responses that help us. We deserve to have safety when we need it. We deserve to have the kinds of accountability that actually make us feel repaired and restored. And the current model doesn't allow for that. I've recently started gardening, and I had this plant that I really loved, and it was out in the sun. And all of the leaves, it was like this big, majestic, plant. And all of the leaves died. And I didn't know why, right? And so I'm getting into it, I'm looking into it, but I'm looking at them like they seem like the leaves burned. And so a part of what I did is I took the plant in the house. And now the leaves are growing, it's looking vibrant. And a part of what had to happen was I couldn't just keep the plant in the same context and think that something else was going to come of it. And so a part of what abolition offers us is to say that we have to experiment and think about different kinds of approaches. And if something is not working, we deserve to try something else. And when I brought the plant inside the house and it started growing, it really just gave me a lens into thinking about abolition, because something else started to work, right? And it might be the case that it might come winter and me having that plant in the house might not work, and I'll have to figure something else out. But a part of what we currently have is a system that says, even if it doesn't work, even if it's harming people, this is what it is and this is what it will always be. And that's not the kind of world that people deserve. We deserve to have, the kinds of interventions and help and safety and the resources that we need to thrive. And if something doesn't work, we should have the right and the ability to create something new.
Damn. On that front, you brought up hospital-based violence interventions. And one thing that shamefully had never occurred to me is there's also the element of restoration and care for people who experience the violence. That intervention matters in community and in society, because being able to work through feelings of anger, humiliation, helplessness that came with that violence might have ripple effects on not perpetuating cycles of violence. As one example of your argument that we need to get to the underlying causes and think, systemically, think ecologically, to carry the garden example, and not just try to kind of check a box, or take a one-off approach to fix something.
For sure. I think that's critical. And so that's a part of what I try to do in the book, is to showcase is there's other ways where we can think about interventions and wrapping people with support and care, and resources in order to, help prevent and disrupt certain cycles. And so I think the hospital-based violence interruption programs that I talk about are, really important in engaging that kind of work, and also reframing these issues as matters of public health. And when we think about it, in a different lens, in a different way, and when we sort of just disrupt it from thinking about the current model that says crime, police, courts, prison, we see that there's so many different ways that we can think about safety. And I just also want to, thinking about the ecological example, a part of what I include in the book is a study that showed that the transformation of an abandoned lot into a green space created a statistically significant reduction in violence in a neighborhood. And so that's another example when we think about how can we think about, fostering and cultivating safety. That's a perfect example of thinking outside the box. And again, when we don't start from the premise that policing equals safety, there's so many different things that we can really nourish and develop and cultivate that can really bring us towards a safer world. And so, I think that that's key. The other part of this is also, the current model that we have says, people are punished and disciplined when things, when there's some kind of infraction. But again, a part of what that creates, and we see this, throughout society, is that a part of what we also need is to figure out, again, as to how to get at the root of what happened and actually asking those difficult questions that move us beyond this idea that somehow punishment will disrupt cycles of harm and violence and conflict. And so a part of what that also, means is trying to figure out in moments, is what if someone is harmed, or someone experiences something that makes them feel unsafe. A part of what that means is figuring out how they can be wrapped in resources and figure out ways to engage in accountability that actually gives them what they need, and thinks about repair and restore. We also have to think about patterns of harm doing and figure out why those things are occurring and how can we actually disrupt those cycles. And that moves beyond this simplistic narrative of like, you do the crime, you do the time, right? And so it really compels us to say, it's like, well, what's going on? Because if we actually want to create a safer world, we have to figure out why these patterns and cycles are happening to begin with. We know that there are certain things that are harmful that are criminalized, right? And there's certain things that are criminalized that are not harmful. And so a part of what crime and the framework around criminalization does is it creates an ideological capture for how we understand and how we respond to matters related to safety and justice and accountability. And so that's also why you'll hear me in as we talk and as you'll see in the book is I use the framework around criminal legal system and to not call it the criminal justice system. But a part of what I also do is try to disrupt this narrative that crime is actually a suitable container for how we understand safety and justice. It's really trying to push back against many of these common sense, associations and assumptions that we've come into, right? When you go into a community, even as crime rates might increase or decrease, it's not like people's feelings around safety are tracking on to crime rates in that way, right? Mm. When you ask someone what makes them feel safe, when you ask someone, if they feel safe in their community, that doesn't just get, tracked down to crime statistics. But so what that means is that we also need to move beyond how we understand safety and how we understand just to really start asking people, questions to really get at the qualitative realities that go into making people feel safe and that go into, creating moments of repair and restoration. So as I discussed in the book, a part of moving beyond policing is not just about police, right? There's an entire criminal legal system, but there's also a number of different social and cultural realities that give rise to us, thinking about safety and justice in the ways that we do. And so a part of moving beyond policing is moving beyond, all of those assumptions and really challenging the social and cultural underpinnings that create a reliance on policing to begin with.
You propose the idea of the safety mobilization as a counter to existing forms of policing in addressing when harm occurs, addressing that harm, but also in addressing the underlying issues that led to that harm in the first place. I think when I think about folks that might be skeptical of the idea of abolition or skeptical of the idea that there could ever be a society without police, I think it would be helpful if you could paint a picture of what a safety mobilization approach would yield in the aftermath of, let's say, like a crime that involves, heinous violence. How does a safety mobilization respond to that moment in a way that differs from how policing currently would respond to it?
That's a really good question. And so I think we can look at this at different stages. The way that I frame it in the book, just thinking about how we can reimagine safety, is by thinking about it in three different ways. So one, we can think about prevention, right? So we talked about that a bit, and that's all the ways that we can prevent these moments from happening to begin with. And I discuss a range of different ways and approaches, both, social, different kinds of cultural shifts, and also different kinds of, safety intervention work that can occur before these moments happen. The second piece, which is what, getting into what you're asking, is around intervention. And so moments where there is a moment of harm or violence or conflict, what is an intervention? Who can we call? What is something that can disrupt a moment that is creating a condition of unsafety? And this is where, I think we can really utilize this imagination and to say, if we start from the premise that people need safety and people need help, and we can also start from the premise that policing is not meeting that, expectation, we can start to develop a number of different ways and approaches that can actually create interventions. A part of what I like to say is if we start from square one, let's imagine a context in which, we can have a safety intervention that results in the least possible harm possible. And that also gives, the person that might have experienced the harm, the resources that they need in order to manage and navigate both in the immediate and in the long term. And let's also think about this third thing, which is, responses to these moments once they happen. And I think this is really where we can engage the work of transformative justice and restorative justice to say, if we want, people to have the kind of accountability that feels meaningful, right? Because even when you look at the satisfaction rates, when people go through criminal legal processes, when people are, harmed, or people's families are harmed, people often report that they don't feel satisfied by the outcome of, the criminal legal sentencing or punishment or imprisoning, whatever usually happens. A part of what transformative justice offers us is a framework that allows us to, really ask what is needed, especially in the context where somebody's harmed, what is needed in order for this person to feel repaired or restored or to engage in this kind of healing justice work. But then also it seeks to ask what created this context to begin with, and really, trying to get at the root of that and disrupting it so that these patterns can be stopped. So I really think when we think about it in that way, when we think about prevention, interventions, and response, and we start from the premise that we can imagine various ways, and really we can get into the hard, difficult situations, right? We can get into the ones that feel, very heavy and complicated. If we don't start from the premise that policing or prisons are the answer, because we can see historically that it wasn't even created to be, we can really start to imagine so many different ways and approaches that can actually get at, the realities of how we can disrupt these patterns and cycles, and also how we can get people the safety and help that they need. Many people in our society right now, with widespread policing, criminalization, imprisonment, don't actually rely on the police or the criminal legal system when they're harmed. There's many people right now that don't have the kinds of resources or responses that they need, even in these moments. And so, a part of the question is to say, okay, well, in society as it currently exists, people don't have that. And we have police, we have prisons, we have mass surveillance and punishment and discipline. And so that's a part of it, is that is not an answer. And many people right now don't experience that kind of safety and accountability and justice from these prevailing institutions, because they weren't designed to do so, and that's not their primary function today. And so a part of it is like we actually do need to have approaches where people can get the safety and the help and the justice and accountability and the healing that they need. But we have to start from the premise that we can do that without relying on, policing, prisons, criminalization, because it's not doing that now, and it's widespread all across society.
You do this thing in the book that is both refreshing and really hard to read, which is you have these interludes where you're describing interactions that you've had, where you're juxtaposing the book is a very accessible book to read, but obviously the main chapters are moving through ideas. And in the interludes, you go into your personal stories. And one refrain that you kind of bring up again and again as we're experiencing these stories is that you never thought to call the police. And I found that to be such a deft way of communicating, particularly like to white audiences who are more comfortable with the police, that from a young age, calling the police was never an option, even when your life was in danger.
Exactly. And I guess that, the last question is that, as I mentioned, many people in society experience moments of violence and danger and don't call the police. And so for all those people, for me, as a young person, for me, someone growing up in the world and experiencing, a number of different things that I mentioned in the book, where are my options? I relied on community, and I'm grateful that I had community support and the support of my family and loved ones and my, networks to help me navigate those moments. But many people, experience a range of things and don't have the kinds of responses and help that they need in moments, And, I can look back at a number of different situations where I would have loved to have some kind of safety, intervention, or where I would have loved to have some kind of response that could have helped me, navigate that moment. And so, it was important for me to include that because, part of me writing this book, it's not like I'm just like a distant person from this material, it's I live through a lot of the things that I write about. And so, as you mentioned, it's like I experienced a number of concerns and grave danger, including moments when my life was in danger. Idea of calling the police never came to my mind. And so that calls into question is like, one is like, I relied on my community. And so in a very direct way, I saw how community-based approaches can create safety interventions and help. But a part of what that also means, as I mentioned, is that there are already people right now, including me and, in these stories that I discuss, that are experiencing a range of different kinds of situations that can be unsafe or harmful or violent. And the police are just not, an option that seems viable. And so I think that really, was important for me to include because, as I mentioned, I'm writing about these ideas, but I'm also writing about my own life, and I'm writing about the life of my family. I'm writing about the lives of the people within, my communities that I've seen, that I've been able to, bear witness to. Policing is not solving or not answering the concerns of many different communities and people. And again, a part of what the other stage of this is, even again at what they purport to do for people that seemingly believe in their legitimacy as an institution. Look at the clearance rates, to see that what is the efficacy of police interventions and what they're even purported to say that they are meant to do. But then also the other piece again is like, look at what police actually do with their time. And a part of what you'll see, and I include in this book, is that it'll disrupt some of the common sense understandings around what police do, or the role of policing in society. And so I think for many people, and for me early on, as I mentioned earlier, there was these underpinnings of experiences that made me see that policing is not a legitimate institution and it's not a reliable mechanism for safety. But again, it's like, even when you look into on its face what policing is purported to do, it really varies from what it actually does.
Mm. You also talk about why police reform, even though it often sounds nice on paper, doesn't lead to meaningful change, and in some cases actually like makes the situation worse. How do you compare, first of all, if you could get into a little bit more on that front, like why doesn't police reform work? And how do you juxtapose that with community-based approaches and sort of within a transformative justice approach?
Really great question. So when we look at the history of police reform, and I talk about that history in the book, is like we can look back to the early 1900s when there were widespread calls to reform the police, right? A part of what we see is that these reforms are often recycled in different variations, particularly in moments when the legitimacy of policing is called into question. And what we see, from going back, things like training, different kinds of use of force standards, now we see like body cameras and different kind of technological, reforms and responses. What we see is that they're not stopping flows of police violence and abuse and corruption. And when we look back into the early 1900s, when these reform efforts started to really expand, and I trace that history in the book, is that over 100 years of reform and police violence is still rampant. What that gets to is that the problem is not, tinkering with the system or just trying to reform, particular aspects of it. It's the institution itself. It's policing itself. If there are reforms that are not scaling back police presence, police power, police resources, that it will not actually create a kind of intervention. Because again, at the core of this is the realities of police power, right? And policing itself. And so, part of what I like to say is like, if it's an intervention or reform that is not scaling back policing in some form, whether it's, in resources, presence, technologies, tools, if it's not scaling that back, then it will just preserve or expand police power. We can look at the past 10 years. The past 10 years of police killings, according to Mapping Police Violence, show us that the rates have not dropped. Police killings have remained fairly stable. And even when we look more recently at a year like last year, the rates are even higher than in the past decade. But this is also the past decade of a widespread, range of reforms that emerged following, the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson. And so we have so many different reforms that have emerged, but it hasn't affected the rates of police violence? Again, it's because at the core of this is police power and the realities of policing itself. And so a part of what we need to think about is then how we can start to scale back, in this context, thinking about, an abolitionist vision, how we can really start to scale back the presence and power of policing and criminalizations and punishment and incarceration within society. And so, that gets to your second question, is that, okay, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, a geographer and abolitionist, talks about abolition is not about absence, it's about presence. And it's about building life-affirming institutions. And so if we think about it from that lens, then we can think about, the question of what is life-affirming. Ruth Wilson Gilmore also says, where life is precious, right? And so when we invest in the kinds of approaches and, institutions and systems that are life-affirming, we start to create a number of different kinds of conditions that we can experience in society. And so, I think that that's a really just important way we can think about it. And so, the safety work, as we talked about, the safety mobilizations, things that can be developed like community safety hubs, actually transforming, society to not thrive off of profiteering and capitalism, right? Because so much in society exists not because it has to be, but because it is, because, often political decisions that are made every single day. Even when we think about people who don't have enough food, there's more than enough food to feed everyone in society. There's more than enough homes to house everyone in society, right? So if those things are not guaranteed, then why? We can have healthcare for everyone. Why don't we? Right? And so we can have quality education for all, but we don't. And so when we start to really dig into these questions, we start to really get at some of what underlines, the conditions that then a part of the consequences is creating, things in society that people can experience harm by. Again, it's like if we start from square one with the premise that people need safety, people deserve safety, people, deserve and need help when they need it, and people deserve accountability, and people deserve healing and repair. Let's start from square one and imagine a world where that can be.
It's kind of wild reading this book and also encountering the fact that, police budgets are $100 billion every year, and getting to your point around like, we have the abundance, we have the food, we have the houses, and more importantly, we have the budgets to fund all kinds of safety mobilizations. Where instead of exclusively calling 911, you reference like calling a 727 or like having these different 3-digit numbers you call when there's, an intervention needed necessarily across different needs. But we're so conditioned to believe in this kind of like vengeance, kind of payback, punishment mode that we don't even allow ourselves to think into that, even as we look around and see that we totally have the means. We just don't currently, we aren't all embracing our imagination.
And, the resources are going somewhere, and it's not going towards these things that, are life affirming. It's policing, imprisonment, and also, militarism abroad, warfare, that look at the amount of money that gets spent on, military budgets, look at the amount of money that is spent on policing and imprisonment. There are the resources in order to build and cultivate different ways of being in relationship to one another, and to really invest in these life-affirming, approaches and institutions and ways of thinking about how we can organize society. So the resources are there. It just becomes a question of where are they going. It also becomes a question of creating a society in which the political decisions that are made actually operate in the interest of the public. Right now, the kinds of hierarchical models of government don't allow us to really be in the driver's seat for creating the conditions that can really be transformative, right? And so a part of this is also getting at the question of like, where are the resources going, and why is it that people are not having the direct ability to really, decide and help steer the kinds of decisions that affect us all, because many, decisions that are made don't operate in the interest of the vast majority of people that, they're allegedly said to be made for. And so part of this is also thinking about how we can develop, which I talk about in the final chapters, is like how we can also develop different kinds of ways of relating to one another and relating to resources and the environment and the world that allow for, direct forms of decision making and participation, to where people are empowered to be able to create the kinds of conditions that we deserve that can actually be transformative.
I'd love to talk about particularly the final chapter. You make a very compelling case throughout the book about why, but then that final chapter really kind of really lands the plane in like helping us imagine and visualize. And you're very careful to point out repeatedly that there's, an infinite number of approaches to abolition, and yours is just one. But reading that chapter, like I almost wanted to cry, because it was like, that would be such an amazing world. So if you could just share what that speculative reality is, a world beyond policing.
For sure. And so that was actually, a really important part of the book for me to write, just in terms of thinking about the overall argument, but for myself, to really put myself in the context where, I said, okay, if this is the world that I want to, envision, what does it look like? What does it feel like? What does it smell like? What do you see on a day-to-day? What are interactions like? What is it like going into a grocery store and not having to worry that someone might not have the money in order to afford groceries? What does it look like when kids are able to grow up as kids? What does it look like when elderly are able to age with dignity and have the kinds of, health care and resources that they need to age with dignity and grace? What does it look like when we have the ability to make decisions over our lives that affect people directly, and that where people are, actually empowered to make those kinds of decisions on a day-to-day? What does it look like when we have housing for all? What does it look like where no one has to worry about not having access to drinking water, right? What does it look like to be in a world where we don't have to worry about environmental catastrophe all the time? So these are the kinds of things that really really struck me as I was writing this. What does it look like to have art that is not linked to profit or capitalism? What does it look like to be able to mobilize all of the kinds of technological innovations for human good and for that which is life affirming? And so, I really start, I think about 2105, and I think like, what does an abolitionist future look like? I had already been steeped into conversations and discourse and arguments around abolition. But a part of what working on that last chapter did is it allowed me to see it in a different way. It allowed me to feel it in a different way, And there's a way in which, as I was writing about the histories and the currents, it's important. I think I was like charting out these legacies and these trajectories, but really putting myself into the future and thinking about what does a world look like? Because a part of what I talk about, in the book is that moving beyond policing isn't just moving beyond policing. It means moving beyond so many different realities within society that create a reliance on policing to begin with. And, changing those realities and starting at the root. And as Ruth Wilson Gilmore says, the point is to change everything. And so, that's what that last chapter really showcases, is like, what does the world look like where everything is changed in a way that allows for abolition to flourish? And as I mentioned, there are many different visions, and I want to think alongside others in thinking about that. But a part of what that means is that we have to suspend our disbelief in what seems politically possible in order to imagine a world that we deserve.
Amazing. There's so much more we could talk about and that I'd love to talk about, but you've already been very generous with your time. No, sure. I have 3 questions I like to close each episode with. The first is, what is one thing you wish people paid more attention to?
That the answer to so many of our issues already exists. We just have to look, and then we have to experiment and develop.
Amazing. What is one resource you use or recommend for making better sense of reality?
The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Wengrow is a really, important book, I think, to just think about how we understand everything, and really to rethink, the things that we accept as common sense, and to really think about, a lot of those things in different ways.
Schismogenesis. And finally, what is one moment when your sense of reality was disrupted?
When I was an undergrad, I heard about this theory called symbolic interactionism. I was studying sociology, and it came up in a course. And a part of what symbolic interactionism says is that the meanings we ascribe to things shape how we interact with them. And for me, it was really an entryway into understanding what it means for something to be a social construct, right? It's something that is socially constructed. And when I started to learn more about it, it really caused, a fracture in what I always thought, was the case, that there's just certain things that they just are, and it's just, it just is what it is. But a part of what that really disrupted, and so it was really just a lane into me understanding social constructs, is that it helped me see that so many things in society exist because people said it to be so. But what that also means is that other things can exist too.
Hell yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, first of all, everybody should go by Beyond Policing. Secondly, is there anything else coming up, or any news, or things to share, or places people can find you?
Check out my website, philipvmcharris.com/Beyond Policing. I keep up to date in terms of, tour stops and, different developments around the book. And so I definitely encourage you to check it out. You can also get the link to buy the book there, and you can see recaps of, the events, and see where I'm headed next, and see what next, is in store for Beyond Policing.
Amazing. Phil, this has been so illuminating. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your work in creating this space where we can think about the future in different ways.
This podcast is edited and produced by Adam Labrie and me, Jesse Damiani. The podcast is presented by Reality Studies. You can learn more by visiting realitystudies.co. And if you appreciate the work I'm doing, please subscribe and share it with someone you think would enjoy it.